How art thou fallen from heaven? Hailel, son of the dawn. How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low? Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and today we're going to look at the rest of Isaiah chapter 14. Well, most of the rest of it. This is a very famous part of Isaiah, and in later both Christian and Jewish interpretation, this would sometimes be associated with a tale of Satan. Let's talk about that. This is part of my ongoing series on the book of Isaiah. If you want to see it from the beginning, I have a whole playlist on it. This is a channel where we look at the Hebrew Bible and its meaning and context in archaeology and in linguistics. And today we're going to tackle this particular poem about Babylon and maybe something more. What did Isaiah know about Satan? The word Satan occurs 27 times in the Hebrew Bible. The word means adversary or possibly accuser, and frequently does not refer to the Prince of Darkness himself. First, I think we have to ask, what is Satan? This is something that has developed significantly in post-biblical Christian and Jewish thought. Post-biblical from the Hebrew Bible perspective, of course. The Christian New Testament does do a lot to advance the development of the character of Satan. And then even after New Testament times, both Jewish and Christian authors would add more and more layers to both the idea of a Satan figure as well as just demonology and angelology in general. So when we say Satan in the modern understanding of it, what is it that we specifically tend to think of? We tend to think of a specific individual fallen angel that is evil. It is someone who tempts others to commit sin. It is one who fights God and has nothing good in mind for mankind. It is one who is a source of evil and calamity in the world. If we understand Satan to be this, that figure is mostly absent from the Hebrew Bible. The Eden story doesn't mention a Satan. In the Eden story, it's just an ordinary talking snake. The Cain story never mentions Satan. He just on his own decides to take the actions that he takes. The first time we actually see the word Satan appearing is all the way over in Numbers chapter 22 with our beloved story of Balaam's ass, where the rather wise donkey stops because he is being blocked by an angel who is acting as a Satan, someone who opposes, someone who gets in the way. This angel is clearly not evil and is clearly acting under divine orders. And so we have to think about this when we think about what the word Satan would mean. The next time we run into it is out of the Torah entirely and over into 2 Samuel. There in chapter 19, verse 22, David uses the word speaking of political enemies. And likewise, 3 more times in 1 Kings, again speaking of political enemies. All the other mentions of Satan are almost certainly from writings which occurred after the time of Isaiah. And so that's really all the background of a Satan that there is by the time Isaiah is writing, is an angel that stood in the way of Balaam and political enemies of Israel. Now, if we look at the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the general thought among scholars is that the idea of Satan developed out of Zoroastrianism, which is a religion from Persia. It focuses on the forces of good and evil in this battle with one another, a sort of balancing happening between them. And that from this idea, there came the idea that there had to be opposed to God some sort of equal opposite, perhaps, but perhaps not quite equal, but that there was another being which acted in opposition to him, and that this might have been the development for the idea of Satan. In Psalm 109, the word Satan shows up, and it is a parallel to the phrase wicked man, and the title is applied to a teller of lies. And so we start to see some of the ideas here coming in of what a Satan figure would be. The most famous episode of Satan in the Hebrew Bible is in Job, chapters 1 and 2. And the Satan figure shows up there in those first 2 chapters and then never again in the rest of the book. There seems to be a bit of a frame story with those first 2 chapters and the last chapter of the book that frame the more poetic middle part of the book with giving it this story of why this is happening, a sort of a background as well as a resolution at the end. Although, interestingly, the resolution at the end does not mention the Satan anymore. It is generally considered that this frame story of Job was written later after the rest of the work, that it existed in this series of poems that make up the book proper, and then the frame story was added at the beginning and the end to give a little more background or context to the poem. The other place that Satan shows up is in Zechariah chapter 3. Now, this has the Satan showing up in the temple of all places, and he's standing in opposition to the priest there before he is banished, and then the priest is then dressed in his priesthood attire. This is the only prophet that writes about Satan is Zechariah, with this Satan showing up in the temple and being cast out. Then there's a very, very odd reference to Satan in 1 Chronicles 22:1, where Satan tempts David to sin in numbering Israel. This is probably the place where he fills his most familiar role in the Hebrew Bible, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The only time in thousands of years of history here that Satan actually goes about tempting somebody is in this very late, one of the last books written in the Hebrew Bible. And the thing that he does, his one temptation he gets in the entire Hebrew Bible, is to tempt to have a census. Yeah, the whole Bathsheba and Uriah adultery murder thing, that wasn't Satan. The census was Satan. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's very problematic. Even for the book of Chronicles, it's not consistent because he shows up nowhere else in Chronicles. And so the thought that he's suddenly inserted here in this one particular function in a very odd choice of things to tempt David to do means that this verse is probably a later addition to Chronicles that wasn't even reflective of the main author of Chronicles. And so that's probably a very late intrusion into the text. But of all David's missteps, a census, really? That's all we have. That's it. That's all of Satan in the entire Hebrew Bible. He never takes on really the form that he would take on in later Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, in some of the writings of Jewish rabbis, in the Christian world, where he is seen as this great tempter and this opposition to God, father of lies, and all those great things. He never seems to have quite that role there. His role in the book of Job is kind of interesting. He clearly doesn't have anything good in mind for Job. He seems rather gleeful at attacking Job, and he has to be restrained. He doesn't quite seem like the typical figure. He seems to be part of the divine council, appearing before God and following God's instructions, and only able to act where explicitly permitted by God to do so. So that's the Satan character that exists in the Hebrew Bible. And most of it was written after Isaiah wrote. Isaiah himself never uses the word Satan. The name Lucifer, you will see very famously in the King James version of this chapter, as well as some other versions that follow it. It doesn't come from the text. It comes from the Latin Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of this. It is a fair, rough approximation of the meaning of the Hebrew word Helel, which means bright one, shining one. Lucifer means one who carries light. It works. It's a fair translation of the name. But it was explicitly included in this chapter from the Vulgate because it had come to mean Satan. And so associating this chapter with the fall of Satan from heaven became a very important thing for some groups. Now, the question is that fair at all? Is this about a divine being cast out of heaven, or is this just simply about the king of Babylon? Well, let's read it and see what we come to. We've already covered the first 3 verses of this chapter. That brings us to verse 4, where we're going to start today. You will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. Now, I will note that the word here, take up, is the Hebrew word nasah, which means to lift or carry something. And it is from this word that we get the word masa, which is a burden or oracle that we've been discussing about. This whole section is known as the oracles against the nations. This word is probably chosen explicitly to remind us of that word, even though this portion is not referred to as a masa. It tells us that we are to take it up. We are to nasa this Mashal. This is a Mashal here, which is the word that we translate as proverb. Some translations translate it as taunt. The word actually kind of means parable. It's the idea that it is a story that parallels something against something else, often used for wisdom, just as the book of Proverbs is full of things like this that give us guidelines for wisdom based on very simple examples, real world examples. And so, yes, we would take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, this parable, this thing that shows a parallel to something else. So immediately you're wondering, what is the other thing and what is it that we're supposed to gain from this? Often a proverb was a cautionary tale. We see the word used in Deuteronomy 28:37, where it's, and thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb and a byword. The proverb is like being told about the captain of the Titanic. It's not something you want to emulate. It is something that you will warn against to avoid making the same mistakes. I'm not really sure that I like translating this as taunt. I think that I prefer proverb or parable here, because I don't think it's as simple as a taunt. I think this is intended to be an illustrative story to teach something. And so we continue on here. How the oppressor has ceased. The insolent fury ceased. This starts with this word here, echa. How? How has this happened? It often is the beginning of like an elegy where people are talking about a tragedy that has happened. How has the city fallen, that sort of thing. But here, it's a little ironic. They're using this word, how has the oppressor ceased? It is clearly an exultant poem that is celebrating the death of a tyrant. Now, this word here for insolent fury, it is a word that shows up only here, and we're not actually sure of its meaning. The Qumran Dead Sea Scroll actually has a indication here that there were two Hebrew letters, Dalet and Resh, which look very similar, that got confused, and that the word that is in the traditional text is madheva. So it is from that correction that we think that it might mean fury or onslaught here. But the King James Version went with the Golden City, which is simply incorrect. It's because they had no idea what this word meant and they were just guessing. Yeah, it should be something that is parallel in this line to the oppressor being ceased. So his onslaught, his fury also being ceased makes more sense. The Lord has shattered the staff of the wicked, the rod of rulers. This word rulers, the word is very similar to the word for proverb above. And this appears to be an intentional play on words. They're somewhat of homonyms here. A ruler is a proverb. And so the ruler himself is the proverb in this. And this is one of our first clues, is that he's calling the ruler a Mashal that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. This word for persecution, which is murdoth, is also nowhere else. And it's just a guess from context, since it is parallel to the word for blows. Blows, persecution, sure. This is not a word that we really know the meaning of. We're just using context to figure out what it should probably say. The whole earth is resting quiet. They break forth into singing. I love that one. So the idea here of everything's quiet and then everything just bursts into song because the tyrant is gone. The tyrant is defeated. And who is it that's singing? It's the trees, of course. The cypresses rejoice at you. The cedars of Lebanon saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. So the trees burst into song, as trees sometimes do. Well, let's talk about a few of these trees here. The cypress in Hebrew is barosh, and it's actually probably a juniper, according to Helel, the Juniperus phoenicia, which is not a very big tree. It's only about 5 to 8 meters tall. Pliny and the Septuagint say that it was a cypress. The Latin Vulgate says fir tree, which is what's followed by the King James Version. Helel seems to be drawing its conclusion based on a very similar word in Akkadian. I'm not sure I'm convinced this is this lowly little juniper here. The Mediterranean cypress is far more stately. Isaiah mentions this tree 5 times And his references seem to indicate that it is stately and tall. In 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 8, Solomon requests timber from this particular tree, and I don't see how you could get timber from that lowly little juniper tree. If instead it was the Mediterranean cypress, that fits a lot more likely as a tree that could be used in these types of ways, that it represented something lofty and tall and used for timber. Now, the other thing that's mentioned here is the cedars of Lebanon, very famous tree in the Bible there. The problem is that, according to Helel again here, the Abies silicia, or Sicilian fir, is actually more likely to be the famous cedar of Lebanon, rather than the Cedrus libani beryl, which is also not well suited to be used as timber and is not likely to have been the cedars of Lebanon that are referred to in the Bible. The word for cedar is erez, but fir of Lebanon just doesn't quite have the same ring, does it? But the cedar of Lebanon is probably this fir tree here that looks, again, very majestic, very, very beautiful conifer, could very easily be looked at as a great source of timber, being used for all the things that we hear the cedars of Lebanon being used for. These are lofty, stateful trees that have been laid low by the king of Babylon. And so already we're talking about something that is very non-historical here. We have trees bursting into song. We have the king of Babylon being referred to as a woodcutter who chopped them down. Obviously, the trees are symbolic. The king of Babylon's role as a woodcutter is symbolic. And so we've already introduced here that this is a story of symbols. And so what are we really talking about? And who are the symbols of? Let's continue. Sheol beneath is stirred up for you to meet you at your coming. It rouses for you the shades, all the rams of the earth. It raises from their thrones all the kings of the nations. Sheol, the realm of the dead, is stirred up to just come up and swallow this king of Babylon. I've mentioned this already, but Sheol is often translated as hell, but it's not quite like what some people think of as hell. Sheol is more the realm of the dead. It's not a place where just bad people go. Everyone goes to Sheol. That is where the dead go. This is talking about that the king of Babylon is going to be consumed by death, that it will swallow him, that it's happening soon. And this is why the trees are singing. Now it rouses the shades. This is an interesting thing here. For the most part, Sheol in the Bible is imagined as a vast and deep pit that swallows people who have died, and they know nothing but darkness and silence after their death. Here, however, the poet imagines an assembly of spirits of the dead greeting the king. This idea is loosely analogous to the representation of Hades in the 6th book of the Odyssey. And it's hard to know if this whole picture reflects popular belief or is a rather useful and vivid poetic fiction. The word for shades here is the word Rephaim, and it's complicated. The word means literally to heal, but the Rephaim was also a name for an ancient race of giants that lived in the land before the Israelites. So let me read you a couple of snippets from the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament on this word. Rephaim is the spirits of the dead, the shades, especially those of the royal house, according to the so-called Rephaim texts, which are particularly conclusive in this respect. Designating the dead as healers may have had something of a euphemistic sense. Rephaim is a part of the legendary pre-Israelite population in Palestine, whose memory was especially preserved in Transjordan. The Rephaim are a certain memory of the ancient Syro-Canaanite cult of the ancestors, the shades or the heroes. According to one scholar, the earlier power of the dead is now represented in the enormous physical size of this legendary race. So yes, this is a set of giants that live in Sheol that have healing power and are possibly dead kings and maybe ancestors. There's a lot to pack into that as to who these really are. But they live in Sheol, and they are often associated with giants, often associated with healing, often associated with dead royalty. So yes, we have a bunch of dead royal zombies. We've got a great structure here for a Halloween moment. But then we have here that along with the shades, it refers to all the rams of the earth. The animal epithet that's used here is a metaphor. The Hebrew word is atud. It's particularly the dominant male ram of the flock. It's the alpha male, if you will. There's actually a great paper, Animal Names as Designations in Ugaritic and Hebrew, in Israelite Religion and Biblical Theology by Patrick Miller. I will put a link to it in the comments. I will just read from him here how he translates this. Sheol beneath quakes for you to meet your coming, rousing for you the shades, all the he-goats of the earth. This references clearly to all the princes or rulers of the earth who meet the king of Babylon in Sheol. This is one of the clearest and most often cited examples of the phenomenon described in these pages. And he quotes then Zechariah 10:3, my anger is hot against the shepherds, I will punish the he-goats. Again, the prophet has in mind rulers and leaders. So this is the same way that this term is used in Ugaritic, and it's important as we try to understand this in context. Scholars have experimented with all sorts of context to understand this passage, mostly looking at parallels in Mesopotamia. However, it's become increasingly clear that the context is in fact Canaanite, not Mesopotamian. And so he says here, the best known is Ugaritic text 128, the account of Herod's banquet when he invites the bulls and the gazelles of Heber to share his feast. Lady Huria, Herod's wife, brings in the guests. Into her presence, she causes his bulls to enter. Into her presence, she causes his gazelles to enter, the bulls of Heber the Great. Heber, the some sort of title. There's little question that these are high officials or dignitaries in Herod's court or capital. They clearly have some relationship to Herod because the possessive suffix is used in each instance. The designations are poetic rather than formal, appearing in synonymous parallelism rather than coordination. And so we have this idea of noble people being referred to as animals that is a parallel here and speaks to some of the Canaanite context of the understanding of this point. All of them will answer and say to you, so this is the kings, the Rephaim that are in Sheol, they're going to answer and say to you, you too have become weak as we, you have become like us. So this become like us, this is again from the same root, mem, shin, lamed, mashal. It can mean to speak in parables, or it can mean to compare with, to become like something. Its repeated usage seems intentional. Its basic meaning of proverb or parable is one that is taking one thing that is similar to another or a reflection of another. And so it is saying here to him, you have become a proverb like us. There's actually a good article discussing this that I'll link below, the cryptic meaning of Isaiah 14, Mashal, from the Journal of Biblical Literature. The author mentions several scholars who see a complex chiastic structure in this verse. I was also definitely discerning a pattern here, but I wasn't able to put it together nearly as well as he was. He proposes and then in some detail explains how this fits together as a chiasm, and it's not very apparent at all in any translation I've seen. He mentions that Robert H. O'Connell identified a concentric structure centered on the three-verse axis of verses 12 through 14, surrounded by two corresponding entities of 7 units each, from verses 4 to 11 and 15 to 23. Another scholar by the name of Yi considered the four verses 12 through 15 to be the middle of the chiasm, between verses 9 through 11 and 16 through 19 on the one hand, and between 4 and 8 and 21 and 22 on the other. Another scholar, Mark Shipp, proposed a chiastic pattern, including 4 corresponding units organized anti-symmetrically all around a central axis of verses 13 and 14. So there have been many takes on how this should be structured. There's no one answer. The difference, this author writes, is mainly from a disagreement concerning the last verse of the poem. Some authors in the poem at verse 21 and others at verse 23. However, both opinions are challenged by the sudden change in tone and structure observed in verse 21, a feature suggesting that verse 20 is actually the final verse of the poem. In this case, Isaiah 14 poem encompasses 17 verses from verse 4 on through to verse 20, and could be divided into two segments of 8 verses each, surrounding the central verse 12, evoking the mythological figure of Helel ben Shahar. I give you here this pattern that is based on that. I think this is more convincing than any other construction I've seen. I think this is probably right. It's not terribly clear in translation. Some of this is working on homonyms and plays on words, but I believe this is the right way to understand this point. That the oppression has ceased, that the Lord has broken the scepter of the wicked, the nations were cruelly persecuted, the entire earth breaks forth into singing, even the trees rejoice. Then Sheol convokes all the leaders for your arrival. The kings show your decrepitude. Your splendor is now covered with maggots, which we'll get to, and how has the Son of God fallen? And then it comes back through in a reverse there. You intended to govern the heavens. You hope to be like God. You were brought down to Sheol. People contemplate the tyrant has been brought low. He has cruelly destroyed and imprisoned. All the kings rest in glory. You're cast out of your grave, and your lineage will be forgotten. It does work pretty nicely, and it seems to be a fairly complex pattern. Like I said, I really was sensing that there was a pattern here, but it's difficult to put it together. And many scholars have tried to put together something meaningful on this with differing results. I think this one's correct. I think this is the way it really was intended by the author. And this is focused on the word Mashal being reused in this cross responsa faction. So let's continue on. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. The sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. The idea here is maggots below, worms on top. The image is intended to be rather revolting. Your covers are worms, worms are your covers. The Hebrew shows a brilliant pun. Tolea, which is maggots, also means crimson cloth. The monarch who was used to sleeping under sumptuous dyed fabric now has a blanket of worms. This worms here is the feminine of the word that is used in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18 for the word crimson, though they be red like crimson. The crimson dye that they used came from these worms. Isaiah is going to use it again at the end of Isaiah in chapter 66, verse 24, for their worm dieth not. The idea that the wicked king will be covered in crimson worms, and the wicked in chapter 66, verse 24, will have a crimson worm that doesn't die, and yet the repentant, if they are crimson, can be made white like wool, seems to all tie into a theme here. The king of Babylon is covered in crimson. Though we are covered in crimson, we can be made white like wool. And those who are not made white, their crimson is never going to die. So after that disgusting image, we then come to the famous line. How art thou fallen from heaven, bright one, son of the dawn? How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low? So what's the background for this imagery? This whole section is directed to the king of Babylon, who is clearly depicted as a human ruler. Other kings of the earth address him back in verse 9, and he's called the man in verse 16, which we'll get to. And according to verses 19 through 20, he possesses a physical body. But this language that we'll see here in verses 12 through 15, have seen a dual reference in this poem. These verses, which appear to be spoken by other pagan kings to a pagan king, contain several titles and motifs that resemble those of Canaanite mythology, including references to Helel ben Shakar, to the stars of El, to the mountain of assembly, the high point of Saphon, and to the divine title El Elyon, Most High. Apparently, These verses allude to a mythological story about a minor god, Helel, son of Shakar, who tried to take over the mountain Saphon, the mountain of the gods, and his attempted coup failed, and he was hurled down into the underworld. The king of Babylon is taunted for having a similar unrealized illusion of grandeur. One scholar, J.W. McKay, in Vedas Testamentum, I'll put his paper link down in the comments, he translates this, how have you fallen from the heavens, Hailel bin Shachar? How have you been cut down to the ground, O weakling above the nations? It was you who said in your heart, I shall ascend the heavens above the stars of El. I shall raise high my throne, and I shall sit on the mount of assembly, on the slopes of Saphon. I shall ascend above the heights of the clouds. I shall make myself like Elion. But you have been brought down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. For many decades, commentators have found difficulty in explaining the mythological allusions. It used to be commonly accepted hypothesis that the myth of Helel bin Shachar was based on some now unknown Mesopotamian original. But since the discovery of the Rosh Shamra texts, which are the Ugaritic texts, it has been increasingly recognized that the mythology in these verses is more appropriate to a Canaanite Israelite setting. The Mount of Assembly, Har Moed, may be compared with the Mount of El, where the assembly of the gods of Ugarit took place. Saphon is well known from the Old Testament and from the Rosh Shamra text as the mountain of the gods. El was the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon. Elion was a Canaanite deity known from the Old Testament and from Philo of Byblos. And Sheol and the pit feature frequently in Hebrew cosmology. However, although the majority of scholars would now agree that the natural setting for the myth is to be found on the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, they debate the provenance of the myth, and about the identification of Helel and Shakar continues. The theory most widely favored today is that Isaiah 14 is a nature myth and that Helel is the shining one, the brightest star in the morning sky, which is Venus, the morning star. Venus, like Mercury, lies inside Earth's orbit and appears in the west at the evening following the sun to rest, and in the east at or before dawn, rising before the sun. Because of its orbital path, it is never seen to attain the celestial zenith before it is blotted from sight by the light of the rising sun. Instead, it seems to the observer that it is unable to ascend above the stars of El and is compelled to descend from its highest point towards the morning horizon, eventually disappearing from view as if it were cut to the ground and brought down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. That's the theory, and I kind of like it. There's questions around Helel if it represents Venus or if it possibly represents the crescent moon, but I think Venus is the better alternative here, that we are talking about an astronomical phenomenon here. Venus, you will often hear it called the evening and morning star, because that's where it appears. Because it is closer to the sun than we are, it never is far from where the sun is. So when it is on one side of the sun sets and we see it in the west. And when it's on the other side of the sun, we see it in the east before the sun rises. Mount Saphon is frequently thought of as being towards the north celestial pole, which in our time, there is a star there known as Polaris. But in Isaiah's time, it would have been a little bit different. But the stars all turn around that point. And so if you watch the night sky, as they did, because they couldn't watch YouTube yet, they saw that the stars all turn around a central point, and they thought of this as the peak of a mountain. And there it is, some 40 degrees above the horizon, this point around which all the stars turn, and that point is straight north. And so they see this planet, this wandering star that changes its position, unlike all the rest of the stars, and it climbs higher as though it would climb to that very cosmic mountain, only to then lose its way and fall back down. That seems to be what we're describing here as we talk about Helel ben Shakar. Ben Shakar, of course, is son of the dawn, which leads to the idea that this is, in fact, Venus, that tries to climb up only to have the sun come up and disappear. Now, there is a bit of an effort to associate this passage with Phaethon, the son of Helios, who drove the sun chariot and lost control, and Zeus had to strike him down with a lightning bolt, which wound up driving the sun chariot into the ground and creating the Sahara Desert. It's a fun connection, but it's pretty unlikely. There's a much stronger connection to Canaanite imagery throughout. This particular story seems to be a bit unique. Now, this word for cut down in Hebrew, it is a term that is particularly associated with chopping down trees. And so we do have, again, a callback to the trees that we're happy that no woodcutter had come up against them, as we see them rejoicing that he will be cut down to the ground and put into the pit. So we continue on here. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of El. I will set my throne on high. I will sit in the mount of assembly, in the far reaches of Tsaphon. This starts here with, I will ascend to heaven. The arrogant presumption links this tyrant to the Tower of Babel and many other biblical texts. The idea of an arrogant tyrant ascending to heaven is a recurring theme in the Hebrew Bible. The Mount of Assembly, the Mount of the Divine Council here, the very top of Tsaphon. This is essentially to Canaanite mythology what Olympus was in the Greek tradition. The cosmic mountain in the north, as we talked about with the stars circling that area, it was a place where the eternal ones sit, because in the northern hemisphere, those stars never set. They just move in a circle around that northern point. And so unlike other stars that have settings and risings, these just moved in a circle. And so they had a sense of eternity about them. Among those stars was the Big Dipper, which is been called out as a very distinct constellation for a very long time. It was a useful constellation to use to get your bearings, to find that northern point in the sky. Even when the northern celestial pole was a bit different than it is today, it still served basically that same function. Now, the ancients did know the night sky really well, and it doesn't take long with a dark sky to become very familiar with all these constellations and to learn how they move. It's basically like looking at a giant clock surrounding you that turns gracefully around a single point in the north. Of course, the shapes and the stars would be given names and backstories, and all these odd wandering planets that they see, 7 of them, they don't follow the orderly movements of the rest, and so they must be special. And they would assign special stories to them. As an old shepherd laying out in his field, talking to his sons and telling him of the wisdom that he has collected over his lifetime, I can see him using the stars as a guide to help him remember the stories and pass the stories on in a way that would be memorable. And so these stars became a natural storytelling point of all cultures. And if you've never seen a dark sky and how bright the stars actually are, definitely put that on your bucket list. I live out west and we have lots of dark skies, and it is spectacular and beautiful. And many people who have lived their entire lives in urban areas do not understand just how bright and beautiful the stars can be and how mesmerizing it can be to watch them. So continuing on here, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like Elion. But to Sheol you are brought down, to the depths of the pit. Nice little chiasm there. The Hebrew actually has in verse 15 the word ach, which is, I think, really best left untranslated. It kind of means what it sounds like. Ach, to Sheol you're going to be brought down. Most translations try and put a but or a therefore or a yea or something like that, but ach just kind of says it. Ach, to Sheol you are brought down. It's a bit of a interjection of maybe exasperation almost. Now, he is brought down through the very depths of the pit. This word for depths is the exact same word as was used for the far reaches or topmost point of Tsaphon. It's used as a contrast here, that he ascended to the topmost point of Mount Tsaphon. He's going to be brought to the bottommost point of the pit. Same word being used in both. It does not mean sides, which is what King James Version would win. It means like the furthest reach, the most remote point. Then we continue on here. Those who see you stare at you. They ponder. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms? This word tremble is the same word, ragaz, that we had back in verse 9, speaking of Sheol being stirred up. And there's a bit of a symmetry that's happening here as we refer to the earth now being stirred up or trembling the same way that Sheol was. And so we have this reflection going on. As I said, some of these things don't come across that easily in the translation, but there are definite callbacks through the use of vocabulary throughout this. Who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities and would not let his prisoners go home. Made the world like a desert. This is the word tevel again. Then we discussed it in the last chapter. It's another term for world that is different from the most common word. And here it is used as a contrast to desert, which is really more of its opposite. A tevel was the civilized and habitable land, whereas the desert was the area that had not been settled and was not civilized. And so, yes, who made the world like a desert. He returned things back to a state of uncreation, if you will, that they went back to being a trackless void. He overthrew its cities, and he took people prisoners and would not let them go. The idea of freeing prisoners and taking prisoners from the mighty, of course, is a recurring theme in Isaiah. All the kingdoms, all the kings of the nations, all of them lie in glory, each in his own house, and you are cast out away from your grave. Each in their own house here. The idea here of houses probably refers to tombs, and you can compare that to the book Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 5, where death as a man's eternal home. And so it makes this neat contrast between an honorable burial and being flung from the grave. And so the idea here that all these kings of the earth have honorable burials, but this one will not. He will be cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit, like a dead body trampled underfoot. There's a lot in that is unusual. One of them is the word branch, which is a word that was used previously for a messianic prophecy. The word is netzer, and it was the word that we had back in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, that there would be a netzer that comes out of the stump of Jesse. And this individual is thrown out of the grave like an abominable netzer. I want to be clear, this is not a common word. It's only used a few times. We're going to see it again in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 21, where again it appears to be a messianic reference. So the idea might be that this person was a false Messiah, that he is being cast out as an abominable branch. And then it has that he is clothed with the slain and those that are pierced through with a sword, and like a dead body trampled underfoot. This is all imagery of things that, well, the king of Assyria and the king of Babylon both did, that they rampaged through the cities and left behind horrible gore and tragedy. And it seems to be that it's saying that the king will wear this as his clothing, that his legacy, if you will, these people that he has slain, this acts of violence that he has committed. It says you will go down to the stones of the pit. Another possible there is translated as the floor of the pit. It's a little bit speculative. The Masoretic text says avnei bor, which does mean stones of the pit, but we're not really sure what that means. Joseph Blenkinsop suggested that this be corrected to adnei bor, which can mean sockets, and in Job chapter 38, verse 6, is used for the sockets or the foundation of the earth, that maybe it's saying the foundation of hell. You'll go down to the foundation of hell. Maybe. Another possibility that I think I'm a little more convinced of is that stones is correct, and it refers to grave cairns that were piled up at burial sites. And so the stones of the pit may be a reference to burial spots where they would stack stones to indicate the burial. Moving forward here, you will not be joined with them in burial. because your land you have destroyed, your people you have slain. May he never more be named seed of evildoers. This appears to be the end of the point, that he's not going to have a fine burial, that he's destroyed his own people, and his name will be wiped out. And then it ends with the epithet seed of evildoers as just this final exclamation point at the end for how terrible this person was. And if that's the poem, it's hard to relate it to anything historical. It doesn't seem to be trying to relate to anything historical. We're talking about astronomical imagery, trees bursting into song, dead zombie king ghosts greeting him. Nothing about this strikes as anything historical. It is clearly myth being told, stories through symbols, and it's best understood as stories through symbols. So is it possible that this is talking about some sort of a Satan figure that is passed down from heaven? Yeah, it really is. It seems to reference Canaanite mythology. There are a couple of Canaanite myths about smaller, lesser gods that were cast out from the divine council. Maybe this is about that. The idea that this is not literally the king of Babylon, but that he is being compared to these other images is a very real possibility. Now, of course, Isaiah does not use the word Satan, and probably that word would not have meant to him what it does to later writers. He does seem to be talking about a mythological figure of arrogance and presumption, climbing to on high and being cast down to earth, all of which seems to fit what would later develop into the Satan theology. Isaiah is no stranger to the idea of devils and demons and even dragons. It's not clear if these are meant literally or poetically, but in his writings, they are creatures that dance in the abandoned wastes and represent chaos where order is not present. But they aren't particularly evil. To represent true evil, Isaiah generally turns to politicians. And that's what we seem to see here with the king of Babylon. Also, when we talk about the king of Assyria, that this is a powerful, evil force that rules from the great rivers of the Mesopotamia clear to the ends of the earth, that has armies at his disposal to destroy mankind, to lay waste in a force of uncreation. And for Isaiah, this is what real evil is. And he does seem to relate it to a mythological, astrological phenomenon of an arrogance of trying to attain the highest point of godhood, only to be thrown down by the power of God to the very depths of the pit. That clearly isn't anything historical that you can point to. We don't have kings getting thrown out of heaven, but it is clear that he is linking these politicians with some other type of existing understanding and legend. Now, these next few verses maybe aren't the same poem, but we're going to go through a couple more anyway before we close this, because they fit better here than anywhere else. As we look at 21 here, it says, prepare for his sons a slaughterhouse with the guilt of their fathers. This word for slaughterhouse here is another unique word that's only used here. We think it is intended to be a place where animals are killed. So slaughterhouse seems to work. They shall not rise and take possession of the land and fill the face of the world with cities. So we're talking about here that the progenitors of the king of Babylon are not going to be able to build their own cities throughout the land. That would be terrible. The danger is allowing the royal line to continue and further abuse of power. They are not going to allow his royal line to continue, so his royal line must be slaughtered to avoid that. Now, interestingly enough, the big thing that they called out as his sin was destroying the cities and leaving them like deserts, and they're worried here about his descendants building cities. And so we do seem to have shifted a little in tone with the way this verse is worded, which is part of why it doesn't seem like it necessarily fits with what went before, but might be a slight addendum. Going on to 22, we still have the connection here with the destruction of Babylon, but it seems to be taking a little bit different turn as well. I will rise against them, declares the Lord of hosts, the military name there. And I will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. Notice we have declares the Lord twice, which is interesting. And we have a little bit of a repetition of the theme here of cutting off remnants and names. And so this does seem like maybe these were bits of Isaiah's wording that were floating out there, that maybe this was a good spot to put them in because thematically they belong here, even if they weren't part of the main poem proper. That might be what's happening here. Name and remnant both start with the same letter, as does descendants and posterity. And they seem to be intentionally chosen for sound play. Shem and Shahar, Nin and Loathed. And so they do seem to be chosen for the alliteration there. Continuing forward, and I will make it a possession of the hedgehog and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. This I will make it a possession is actually a reflection back of verse 21 there, that the sons will not take it as a possession. So this is a direct contrast to that. So instead of the sons getting it, it's going to be given to the hedgehog. The word hedgehog is kipod. And in modern Hebrew, that does mean hedgehog, and we think it might in ancient Hebrew as well, but it's a bit of a problem because this seems to be described as a marshland here, where it has pools of water. And hedgehogs don't live in marshlands. Some have suggested that the word might mean heron. The word only shows up 3 times in the whole Hebrew Bible. 2 of them are in Isaiah, and the other one is in Zephaniah, which is clearly quoting Isaiah. The Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament suggests that it is a short-eared owl. King James Version went with the word bittern, which is actually another word for heron. So King James was on the heron side. It might be a short-eared owl. Pools of water that it mentions here are particularly, it means reedy pools or marshlands. And so that seems to be what we're talking about. But is it an owl? Is it a hedgehog? You decide. Tell me in the comments. Which one do you think it is? Then it ends here with this nice cognate accusative. I will sweep with a sweeper, or I will broom it with a broom. And Hebrew, it's this lovely repeated syllable, vatetetia bamatate. And Isaiah loves these words that have this repeated syllable. He uses it several times, and here he's using it in this very distinct, I will broom it with a broom, which sounds like a very strange metaphor. It really does, but it just works with Isaiah because it's this very musically sounding, rhythmic word that's put together here. Both the verb and the noun show up only here. It happens to sound a little bit like the word for slaughterhouse above, so it seems like it is definitely an intentional sound play. But it's just such an unusual choice of metaphor. Anyway, that's the end of this poem and the prophecy against Babylon. We'll pick it up in verse 24 next time as we now suddenly turn our attention to Assyria. And hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe.